Hello, one and all, and welcome to an educational version of Top Deck Thoughts. Now, for this episode, we're going to talk about all the spoilers of Strixhaven and such. Mostly just covered the first day of spoilers. They spoiled a lot of cards. Before we get started, though, I do want to talk about one card that is kind of the controversial buzzkill card of the set. Killing Fiend Potter, a person who I follow on Twitter, very cool creator and such, essentially creates the best pottery and such, had brought the controversy of the character that they presented here on this MDFC, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but let's first just talk about the card in general. So, this is a cycle of what's called kind of like the Dean cycle, which basically, as people know with Strixhaven, there's actually going to be 5 houses, each of them with a different color bear: Orzhov black and white, Quandrus blue-green, Lorehold red and white, etc., etc. And what happens is there's this Dean cycle, which is a rare cycle where essentially it's the Deans of the colleges, and they have the opposing color pair, and you can either cast either side of the card. So, we talk about the card here. First off, the front side, Shelia, Dean of Radiance, 1 and a white for a legendary creature bird cleric. It's a 1/1 flying vigilance, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that enters the battlefield under your control this turn. Pretty good card, I'm going to say that right off the bat. Just the factor is that it can be very useful in token-centric based deck designs. Helps you, especially if you have go wide board states that especially have hasty variety. And the fact that you can tap in with this creature as well as be able to use the tap ability, very nice. Definitely will be useful in counter-centric deck designs. Now let's talk about the awkwardness in the room. Imbros, Dean of Shadow, 4 mana for a 4/4 legendary creature human warlock. It has put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature. Din Imbros, Dean of Shadow, deals 2 damage to that creature. Okay, so just kind of like can be used as either unconditional removal on 1/1s or be used as to buff up your stuff. That's pretty good. And then has whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, draw a card. Okay, so it's used as essentially unconditional, can be kind of used as board protection, especially if you're building a lot of counter-based board presence. That's actually really cool. So, what's the awkwardness coming from? Well, I'm going to link down to a post to essentially what's going on here. To put a long story short, and I feel like I'm just going to link the post to explain it because I feel like it's better to let them talk about the issue and such and explain what's going on. The problem is, Imbros is actually, unfortunately, portraying a very, very stereotypical Asian stereotype of the Tiger Dad, I believe, as Killing Fiend Potter put it. She did a adapted description of her frustration of both the father and son relationship that they're portraying here. It's very cringy, and it was. I'm so excited for the set, as I said before, but I feel bad because I remember Kill Fiend Potter actually being so excited for the set. And then she saw this cliche that they're using of a very, very, very cliche stereotype of Asian descent, essentially, and it was a buzzkill for her, and I just feel really sad, just the fact that the set was kind of ruined because of due to some lazy writing. That being said, I do review cards by the design, but still I am going to link the post down below because I do think that's something you should influence yourself and actually understand kind of like how we can make this game more welcoming to people and just be able to call bullcrap like this when it happens. Okay, that being said, let's look at the design. I think the design is actually really good for the card. It's just the factor is, it's both really good in like an absent counter-based deck design. It both has insurance policies as well as just being able to use this unconditional removal on the backside. If you have a way to get the creature Death Touch, and even if you get the creature Death Touch, you can just use it to essentially be able to pretty much tap, draw a card if you have creatures you're willing to quote-unquote sacrifice, so to speak, that have counters on them. And just like I said before with the front side, great for go wide board-based strategy deck designs. Really great. I like the card from a design standpoint, but the character design on at least the Imbros is very cringy. So, ugh. Yeah, it's kind of a buzzkill, to be honest, but, okay. Let's actually get to the rest of the Dean cycle, and then we're going to talk about these other cards in the set. So, one that I'm excited for, which is the Quandrus Deans, which is Kian, Dean of Substance, and Witherbroom, Dean of Fury. Kian, 2 and a green for a legendary creature Elf Druid. Exile the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it into your hand. Otherwise, put a study counter on it, and it has ability of 4 and a green to create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Then you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each different mana value among non-land cards you own in exile with study counters on them. And then there's Witherbroom Dina Fury, which is a 4/4 for a 3/3 flyer, bird wizard. It has the ability of X and 2 and a blue and tap it to essentially exile the top X cards of your library and put a study counter on each of them. Then you may put a card you own in exile with study counter on it into your hand. Okay. Let's first talk about the commander implications, because everybody's already been pointing out the commander implications. There is actually an infinite combo you can do with Witherbroom Dina Fury, which is technically, if there is a way you can generate infinite mana, you can, and in blue-green, there are combos to generate infinite mana. You can technically make this X large enough to draw your entire deck, put study counters on everything, which exiles your library, and then you can return like a Laboratory Maniac or a Fossis Oracle to your hand, use the last bit of mana you have, play it, win the game. So that is definitely one thing in Commander that I do feel like I need to point out. As for Standard, though, this is an interesting card for Standard. On one hand, I do kind of like both sides of the cards from a janky brewer's perspective. Especially if you're playing something like with Vorinclex on the front side, because creating those XX fractal tokens do require counters, and Vorinclex does have counter synergies, so very nice. And also the ability to tap the Elf Druid Kion down and just being able to get a land card in your hand if it's the top card. Very nice for a semi-card draw that can be used as semi-ramp. Very nice. And just having that mana sync ability that is not a quote-unquote tap ability on the front side. Very nice, especially in Limited where you do need your mana sinks. But in Constructed, especially if you have ways to discount that, which we do have, like, Zerder in the format, it's something to keep in mind if you want to go kind of like a 4-color to, like, maybe even a Bant deck design of some sort. Bant counters, maybe. So yeah, just being able to do that and just make study counters on it, which then synergize with the... Pretty much you can play this turn free, and then when Witherbroom Dina Fury comes out, since you're probably playing, like, maybe a playset to 3 of these in your deck, so you can play the backside of the card. And then if there's any cards that you exiled with Kion that you really want back, then you could just activate Witherbroom's ability and just fetch out that card, as well as get more cards to, quote-unquote, fuel the Kion on making the fractal tokens. So, maybe it's just Quandrit's bias, since that's kind of my house, but I do actually really like this card a lot for a lot more jankier brews. Do I think it's going to be a standard all-star? Probably not. Do I think people are going to try to do the Commander jank of trying to do competitive EDH with this? Probably. Okay, give it a minute to think. There we go. Next up, we go to the Witherbroom House Deans, which is Valentine, Dean of the Veen. 1 black for a legendary creature vampire warlock. It's a 1/1, menace, lifelink. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. When you do, you may pay 2 mana. If you do, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. Okay, this front side is just a really, really good tech card. This is actually one of those where vampires is actually a very popular deck archetype within, like, Historic and such. And we do have a lot of graveyard shenanigans in Historic, so being able to play Valentine turn 1 and just have kind of like a semi-rest in peace, a very nice ability. And the factor is you can also play this later, and if you still take advantage of the exile ability later down in the line in the game, just then being able to have the mana sink of just paying 2 mana and make a token out of it, very nice. Also keep in mind this is very useful, especially when we're in the meta where there's stuff like Kroxa or just like other cards that essentially pretty much automatically die or sack themselves, essentially. Or if an opponent tries to sack one of their creatures with stuff like Village Rites and such, they have to at least consider the fact that their card's going to be automatically exiled. So, very nice tech card. And a 1/1 menace lifelink, especially if you have lifelink synergies, very nice. And also complements with Lisette, Dean of the Root. 4 mana for a legendary creature human druid. It's a 4/4. And whenever you gain life, aka with Valentine or any other lifelink shenanigans, you may pay 1 mana. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain trample until end of turn. don't underestimate the backside of this card. The backside of this card is ridiculously absurd. Because the thing is, there's a lot of cheap ways to gain life in the meta. Like, we have literally, like, 1 mana white spells that's, like, automatically gain 4 life. So, essentially, you could have it where this could be like a 2 mana buff your entire team, give them trample, and just swing in. I could even see this even in kind of like Death Touch tribal shenanigans, because what happens is, since Death Touch gets all the trample, how Death Touch and trample works is it deals 1 damage to the creature, and then all the excess damage is going to be dealt to the opponent. Stuff like that. So, I do really like Lasite Dina Root as just a finisher card, especially in Limited, as well as Standard Constructed in Death Touch tribals. Especially since some of them do have a minor life gain synergy with stuff like the snake, that essentially whenever you attack with a Death Touch creature, you gain a life and your opponent loses life. Stuff like that. And the fact that Valentine can just be used as a 1 mana tech card on the front side, essentially against graveyard shenanigans, it's perfect. The Witherbroom Deans are really good cards, and being them all in one card makes it extra spicy. Last and debatably least, depending on who you ask, I kind of like it, is the I'm going to butcher these pronunciations, so I apologize in advance. Uvilda, Dean of Perfection, 2 and a blue for legendary creature Jin Wizard. I think I'm saying that right. And then there's Nasira, Dean of Expression, 5 mana for a legendary creature Elfried Shaman. Let's talk about the front side first. So it's a 2/2 that has the ability to essentially, you can tap it, exile an instant sorcery card from your hand, and put free hone counters on it. It gains at the beginning of your upkeep. If this card is exiled, remove a hone counter from it. And when the last hone counter is removed from this card, if it's exiled, you may cast it. It costs 4 less to cast this way. On one hand, I like this front part because it is kind of like Balance Suspend to a basic extent, and there's enough extra turn spells that are going to be coming in the meta in Historic, and then there's just the extra turn spells that are powerful late game spells that we have in Standard that getting the 4 mana discount if you don't mind, quote unquote, suspending it and telling your opponent, hey, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming, more or less. Very nice, though the problem is with any suspend kind of like mechanics, that does make it prone to counter magic, so you gotta keep that in mind. Maybe in the sense of have it where you cast the discounted mana spell and then hold up counter magic against a counter, stuff like that essentially. Though there is also the cost that this is a 2/2, and 2/2s are really hard creatures to play in this format, especially when stuff like Bone Crusher Giant exists, so you gotta keep that in mind. Let's talk about the back portion. Nasira, Dean of Expression, 5 mana for a 4/4 legendary creature Elfried Shaman. It has, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until the end of turn, you may cast these spells from among those exiled cards, and you may spend mana as those mana of any color to cast those spells. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, put a +1/+1 counter on Nasira, Dean of Expression. Okay, I think this card's actually a lot better on the back portion than people take at first glance. Mostly because Adventure is still a mechanic within Standard, and technically what people... You kind of don't realize this until you are told, essentially. Technically, an Adventure spell is exiled. Granted, it's exiled in its own semi-special zone, but it's still technically exiled, so... If I'm recalling the wording of this card correctly, when you do cast an Adventure spell, you are essentially putting a +1/+1 counter on this, which, in mostly a majority of pretty much Teamer to Gruul-based Adventure decks, that can be pretty big pretty quick. Plus, also, just its beginning of its upkeep ability, really great, especially just being able to kind of like semi-mill your opponent / get semi-card advantage, which then helps makes this get bigger. Never underrate these kind of like stolen strategy kind of gets bigger when you cast cards that are stolen spells. Like, if Paco from Commander Ikoria has anything to say about that, never ever underrate that ability. So, I'm going to keep my eye on the Nasira, Dean of Expression. I do think this card is actually a lot more standard playable than people take at first glance. Okay, so we got through the... Well, we're almost got through the Deans. Actually, there is one that's... Okay, this one is actually interesting. So we got Plarg, Dean of Chaos, and Augusta, Dean of Order. Plarg, Dean of Chaos, 1 of the lead for a legendary creature Orc Shaman. It is a rare, it's a 2/2. You discard a card, you draw a card, so you rummage. Very nice, actually. And it has 4 and a red. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary, non-land card with mana value 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put all revealed cards not cast this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. And then there's Dean of Order, which is 2 and a white for a human cleric. It has other tapped creatures you control get +1/+0. Other untapped creatures you control get +1. And then whenever you attack, untap each creature you control, then tap any number of creatures you control. Okay, the back half is a little bit of word soup as well as the front half, so let's just break this down from each card. So, Plague Dean of Chaos. It has basically a rummaging ability as well as just an ability to essentially cascade light, so to speak, of any free cost non-legendary spell. This is actually, I still think this card is just good just as a 2-mana 2/2 rummage. If you need to use it aggressively, you can use it aggressively. If you need the card draw aspect of it, you will love to use the card draw aspect of it. Especially if you put this in a Rakdos or Mardu Reanimator deck. Just being able to discard a creature you want to reanimate next turn, very nice. And just being able to draw cards, very nice. Especially if you put this in a draw 2 base strategy deck design. Never underestimate Rummage. Rummage is a pretty powerful ability. And then Mana Sink later in the game to just be able to get more board presence by casting stuff, very nice. And also it's complemented with Agasta Dean of Order. It's a bit of word soup, but basically it's just saying, hey, tapped creatures are going to have more attack, untapped creatures are going to have more defense, and pretty much whenever you attack, you can essentially untap each of them just so that they can essentially have the toughness boost. But if you want to give them the attack boost, you can just tap them down so they can have the attack boost. That is pretty much the best way I'm going to put it. But what I do like about this ability is the factor is you can put this in some cards with, put it in a deck where there's a lot of activated tap abilities, Plarg is the best example of this. And if you don't need the attack boost, but you don't mind attacking in and such, you can attack in, or even not attack in, activate abilities and then start combat. And then essentially, whenever you attack, you untap each of your creatures you control. Remember, it doesn't say creatures you attack with, you just untap all your creatures. And then you activate the tap ability. So you can untap all of them and then activate a bunch of abilities. And then just with the ones that you're attacking in, just leave them tapped so they can have the attack boost. I actually really, really like this card combo a lot. This is actually one that I do think actually has a really, really good chance of... If we get a lot of good activated ability cards, this is a card to keep an eye out of. And of course in Commander, this is actually going to be kind of fun, especially if you put this in an activate tribal deck-based design. Also remember, Zerda is a card in Standard, so keep an eye on that card regarding the Plarg Dean of Chaos, as well as Agasta Dean of Order. Very nice. They are very nice cards. Okay, now I think I got through all of it, so I'm first going to go through real quick, kind of the mechanic cards and such, and then we can just essentially go to the other cards in the set, such as the Planeswalkers down here. So first, let's talk about the first mechanic in the set, using Dragon Guard Elite, which is Magecraft. Which Magecraft basically says, whenever you cast or copy a instant or sorcery spell, do this. Which in this case, it's put a +1/+1 counter on Dragon Guard Elite, and then has an activated ability of 6 mana to double the number of +1/+1 counters on this creature. Overall, this is an interesting card. It's kind of one of those where I kind of like this as well, since we have stuff like Snakeskin Veil in standard meta, so just being able to cast Snakeskin Veil and get 2 counters on this is actually really nice. There's also stuff like Vorinclex in the format, which can synergize well with this. So if you can kind of do a counter tempo deck of sorts, Dragon Guard Elite might actually see some play in that deck. Whether that deck's going to work, that's time to be tell. Though, one thing to keep in mind, you can use this as a combat trick of some sorts, where if you attack in, your opponent tries to block with a 2/2, you then cast an Opt or something, or cast a cheap green spell, and then just automatically buff and then attack, and then just not have to trade in your creature. So keep that in mind. And the Mana Sink is mostly a good limited mechanic, but in Constructed or in Commander, it's something to keep in mind, especially when you're playing Constructed. The other mechanic they revealed for the set is also the Learn mechanic, which we're going to use Professor Symbology here. So basically, there are going to be cards in the set that essentially says, whenever something happens, or it essentially says it's going to say Learn. What is learning? Well, we all know what learning is in general, but what's learning in the mechanical sense? Learn is a mechanic that says you may reveal a lesson card you own from outside the game and put it into your hand. Or you can discard a card to draw a card. Overall, so essentially what this basically says is there's cards like, for example, this one, which is the Professor of Symbology, which is 2 mana 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, learn. That's actually really nice. You can use this as either just a rummage ability, which is nice, or use it to tutor a lesson. So what is a lesson? Well, we'll go above, let's show expanded anatomy as the example of the lesson. So, for example, there's these cards called the lesson cycle. They can be colored. They can also be monocolored, or not monocolored, colorless, which the flavor here, for those who missed it, of why we got color spells in here, it's because the classes that these quote-unquote color spells are in are the classes that all the students have to take before they go into their determined house. That's the flavor. So, for example, for this lesson, it's put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature. It gains vigilance until end of turn. Overall, not a bad spell to put in your main deck, but the benefit here is you can actually have it in your sideboard, or even in draft, you can just put it in your sideboard, since your sideboard can be any size if you don't want to put it in your main deck. And if you have a lot of learn spells, you can essentially do the learn, trigger the learn ability, and fetch the spell from your sideboard, essentially. You do have to reveal it and such, so the opponent knows what spell you have in your hand. But just being able to have these type of spell cycle to essentially more or less be able to tutor out specific powerful spells is something to keep an eye on, especially when we talk about a few of the lessons that have been revealed today. Anyway, quick opinion on expanded anatomy. It's fine. Being able to just essentially spend free mana to just essentially put 2+1/+1 counters and give vigilance to help make it an aggressive, beater, stompy card. Not bad, especially on the right creature, so something to keep in mind. It's also a targeting spell, which could synergize with stuff like Orvar, so you gotta keep that in mind, so it's a fine card. I'm not gonna say it's perfect, but it's a fine card. The one learn card, though, that I have seen in the set that I do actually like quite a lot, though, honestly, let's get to... I don't like when it does this. There we go. And now you see why I use Scryfall than Mythic Spoilers, even though I do keep updated with Mythic Spoilers. Anyway, let's get to one of the learn cards that I do actually like a lot, which in this case it's... Let me get to it. This one, which looks underwhelming until you think about it. First day of class. 1 and a red for an instant spell. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until end of turn, and then you learn. So then you can just learn, get your sorcery spell and such, or rummage, which remember, this could just be 2 mana, discard a card, draw a card, rummage. Never underestimate rummage. Rummage is a pretty good ability. Or you can just tutor for your powerful spell, and then get this instant ability, which I think a lot of people are going to underrate this spell. I do think in token-centric designs, they're actually going to like this card, because it allows their tokens to essentially get buffed, as well as have haste if they want to go into the aggressive. Very nice. I do actually like this out of the cycle. I also like the blue one they showed off, which essentially is Pop Quiz. That one's also a really good one. For those who don't know, Pop Quiz, 2 and a blue, draw a card, and learn. So this could either be just draw essentially a card and tutor for a lesson from the sideboard, or just draw a card and discard a card and draw a card. So just kind of like a rummaging effect. This is still just your typical free mana, draw 2 cards, but it is instant speed rather than sorcery speed. That's a really powerful effect, being this at instant speed, so keep an eye on this. This is a pretty good card, especially in controlled deck design, so keep an eye out on it. I don't know if it's going to see play over other draw spells that are currently in the format, but it's something to keep in mind, especially if you have a lesson-based archetype design. Nevertheless, I think that's the mechanics real quick, so let's go through the other cards real quick. We're going to talk about Archmage Emeritus. 4 mana for a creature human wizard 2/2. That hurts a lot, but it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. Okay, for Commander, this is absolutely crazy, especially in Storm decks. Because Storm decks, their main purpose is to essentially draw cards and cast a lot of spells. having this card on the battlefield allows you to get your card draw while you're doing your spell casting or copying spells even. So you can draw a lot of cards, which then helps you maybe cast more spells, which then allows you to draw more cards, cast more spells, and then activate your Storm Payoff and such, or like your finisher and such. So for Commander, I think this card is amazing. For Standard and Historic, I don't know. It's a powerful ability, especially if you're in a Spellslinger deck, don't get me wrong. But the problem is, it's a 2-2. And like I stated before, Bone Crusher Giant is a popular card in the format, at least as of this current recording. There's a lot of popular cards in the format that can automatically remove this like that. So, and the mana investment you have to put in it with 4 mana, I feel like this is going to be a card that the only reason you're putting this in your deck design is if you can get away with it, you can just draw some extra cards. So like 4 mana, draw 2 cards essentially. Or you're just using this as kind of like a clay pigeon to try to remove a more problematic card of removal essentially so you can get your other combo piece out. And if you draw some cards from it, nice. Still, I think this is more of a good Commander card. In Standard, I'll be surprised if it's seed play, but we'll wait and see. Next up, they showed off a common, which is Eager First Year. It's a human wizard 2-2. It's a bear. Whenever you cast a copy an instant sorcery spell, it gets +1 attack until end of turn. Pretty much a limited filler. It's a nice limited card. You can even use this as a human wizard, so if you're playing like a budget party deck, you can use this, especially if it has a Spellslinger archetype aspect on it, you could definitely use it for that. But mostly this is just a decent limited bear, more or less, that has the benefit of Magecraft. Also, quick opinion on Professor Symbology. Really good. Having a piker that does this ability to be able to either tutor or rummage. Very nice. Both in Standard, especially if you're playing like a reanimated strategy, but also like in other just like deck designs, especially if you're just tutoring out for a specific powerful card. Very nice. Then I guess we can talk about Rill and Roland real quick, because this is the first time we see an MDFC Planeswalker, which is cool, but let's talk about him. Okay, first let's talk about the front side. Roland Scholar Sparks. 2 in a red for 2 loyalty, which is really low. Keep that in mind. But it has a really interesting static effect, which is instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Okay, that's kind of cool. And then has +1. This Planeswalker deals 1 damage to each opponent. If you drone 3 or more cards this turn, then it deals 3 damage to each opponent instead. And then there's a -4, which is you get an emblem with whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, you may spend 2 mana. If you do, you may copy a spell, you may choose new targets for the spell. Okay, that's cool. And then we get the backside, which is the Brother Will, Scholar of Frost, 4 and a blue for Legendary Planeswalker Will. It's 4 mana, instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. It has +1, up to 1 target creature has base power and toughness 0-2 until it next turn. It has -3, which is draw 2 cards, and then it has -7, which is exile up to 5 target permanents. For note, that could also be lands, so keep that in mind. For each permanent exiled this way, its controller creates a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. Okay, let's talk about both sides of these cards. First of all, Rowan, I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's really great, though. The problem is just it can't protect itself, which is the really problematic element of the card. Especially being at 2 loyalty, that is very, very tricky. So you gotta like have a big wall developed on turn 2 before you can play Rowan, and hopefully it protects itself and doesn't die to like an eliminate or a very aggressive oriented creature. That being said, being able to ping your opponent, or if you draw a lot of cards, being able to essentially bolt your opponent, very nice. And of course, if you could get to the ultimate, which granted, you can get to the ultimate pretty quick with this card by just only having to activate it 2 times and then do the ultimate, that's a very powerful emblem effect. Being able to copy your spells, instant sorcery spells, just for 2 mana, very nice ability. Also, keep in mind, if you put this in a team or deck design, you could get this out instantly with Vorinclex on the battlefield, so keep that in mind. We also have Will, Scholar of Frost, 4 and a blue for a 4 loyalty legendary Planeswalker Will. It has the same effect of instant sorcery spells, cost 1 less, but let's get to all these abilities. Up to 1 target creature that has, pretty much up to 1 target creature has base power and toughness 0-2 until your next turn. So essentially, it's a way to more or less I guess, the best way to frogify one of your opponent's problematic creatures, which actually is a very cool ability to have on this card. And the fact that it affects it until your turn, very nice. So you can essentially take out their biggest threat, more or less temporarily, or even if you have this out and have like a cheap removal spell. Let's say you have like a shock and they have a 4 toughness creature. You want to remove the 4 toughness creature. Boom, you +1, you shock. Very nice. Also, the fact that you can minus automatically and then draw 2 cards. Never underestimate that ability, especially if you do need the card draw. That's actually really nice. Though having that 1 loyalty when that happens is a little bit. And then if you could get to the ultimate is actually a very powerful effect. Because of a few reasons. Reason 1. There's a... Essentially, you could use this as land destruction for your opponent. And granted, they could get the 4/4 blue elemental creature tokens. But keep in mind, there is actually a spell that came from Kaldheim, which is like the Mystic Reflections, I believe is the card spell's name. Which basically means, like, if you have, like, a 0/1, for example, or 0/2, for example, and then you -7, or just, like, a really low power creature, before they get those elemental tokens when you destroy all the lands, you just do Mystic Reflections, and then just all their elemental creatures will now then just become, like, 0/0s, or 0/2s, or whatever low power creature you give them, essentially. So, keep that in mind, but still, even then, this still can just be used as a finisher on your own end, because 7 mana to essentially get 5 4/4s, that is very, very good. Especially if you play that learn spell, well, essentially anytime a creature enters the battlefield, it gets +1/+1 counter on haste. That is really absurd. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the factor that, essentially, if you get both these out, it makes your instant sorcery spells cost 2 less to cast. That's a very powerful static effect, so I can see Storm-centric deck designs definitely wanting to give this a shot. This is definitely going to be a very powerful commander card. Constructed, I have to wait and see. I do see the potential. I'm going to say that. I do see potential, but I'm not sure, if I'm being legit honest. Okay. And then we're going to get to a few of the lessons. Pest Summoning, which is... This one's pretty quick. 3 mana, sorcery lesson. Create 2 tokens that essentially have, whenever this creature dies, you gain 1 life. This one's more a limited card, but if you're playing a token-centric deck design that benefits with the life gain synergy that you can get when these creatures die, it's something to keep in mind. Especially since you can have it from the sideboard. One of the lessons, though, that I do like a lot, and it's kind of like a... looks like a story moment card. Confront the Past. It's in a black for a sorcery lesson. It has choose one. Return target planeswalker card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Not to your hand, to the battlefield. And then it has also the second choice, which is remove twice X loyalty counters from target planeswalker and opponent controls. Okay, first of all, the feels of this card. The feels. Okay, but the card design itself, really well designed. The fact is that this is a really good either Planeswalker reanimation spell or Planeswalker removal spell that you can tutor out of your sideboard if you have the proper learn-based cards within your deck design. If we can get like a lesson, kind of like learning power, kind of like Planeswalker Super Friends, or just one that has some powerful Planeswalkers within their deck design, this could just be a very easy way to essentially just be like, hey, I'm going to get this card, I'm going to put it onto the battlefield, and then do the automatic effect that I want to do. So I definitely can see Confront the Past seeing some play in kind of like the sideboard in any lesson-centric deck designs. And even it's just good Planeswalker removal. Like, it can remove, depending on how much mana you sink into this, it can remove like a majority of Planeswalkers currently in the format and coming into the format. So that's nothing to underestimate. Now, we do have stuff like Blood on the Snow that is also like good Planeswalker removal against like Super Friends set strategies. But if you're going against like a mid-range deck that has like one powerful mid-range Planeswalker, this could just be a nice thing to tutor and such. And if you're playing a Super Frenzy deck design of some sort, this could just be a decent main board card that maybe you can just main a few and then sideboard a few, and then you can use your learn card that you put in your deck to tutor out the one in the sideboard if you need it. So overall, I really like Confront the Past. I think Confront the Past is a really good card, especially if you have any reanimated base shenanigans. Next up, we're going to quickly talk through the Apprentice cycle. There's a few of them that I like, so I do like Lorehold Apprentice a lot. I do like this for Kaikar builds, for Commander and such, but I also like it that pretty much if you have like Maskwood Nexus shenanigans, or if you have any shenanigans where you're playing powerful spirits within your deck design, just being able to anytime cast a spell and then make your spirits be able to ping, very nice. So keep an eye on Lorehold Apprentice, that's actually really nice. Then we have Prismari Apprentice, which, this one, it's not bad, but not great. Whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, it can't be blocked this turn, so it is still a card that can be aggressive, which is cool. And then, if the spell has mana value 5 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Prismari Apprentice. This is more like, I think if a Tempo Izzet deck is going to be a theme, they might give this card a shot, since being able to have a card that can be unblockable is nothing to underestimate. But I do think this is more like a really good limited card, with some view fringe constructed applications, but I could be wrong. Then the one card that, whoo, this one is really has some potential. Stormkiln Artist. It's not a Apprentice, but it's a good card. 3 and a red for a Dwarf Shaman. It gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. That's not the part we're talking about. We're talking about the Magecraft, which is whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, create a treasure token. Oh my. The fact that we have Burgi, God of Storytelling, which then has it where anytime you cast a spell, which is kind of Magecraft, with the exception of that it doesn't work with copy spells, but whenever you cast a spell, you essentially get red mana. And then have Stormkiln Artist to give you a treasure mana. I do feel like there's just going to be some really, really janky shenanigans you can do with that I'm kind of excited to try out. Plus, anytime you essentially... This is a way to essentially provide mana discounts in a way to your spells because you get treasure, which is like a mana rebound, I guess, for lack of a better word. Rebate, I think it's a better term. So just being able to get mana back from your spells, really nice that you can use for later spells, which then gets you more mana back. Very nice. Keep an eye on Stormkiln Artist. It has some potential for some shenanigans. Another one that I do like a lot, Quandrit's Apprentice. Green and a blue for a 2/2, and has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a land card from among them and put the card into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. I mostly talked about this on Twitter, but I do like that there's actually a funny, kind of like a synergistic combo with its Spore-like cards. Like, we have one in Standard currently, which is called Scale the Heights, where you can play Quandrit's Apprentice on turn 2, play Scale the Heights on turn 3, put a counter on this, and then get a land, essentially, hopefully from the Magecraft ability, so then that could be your secondary land if you already played the third land to essentially Scale the Heights with. That's actually a really nice budget combo, or not really combo, more budget synergy, so something to keep an eye on. Overall, I do like this card, and of course, if you're playing like Storm-based shenanigans, you're going to have a blast. Not again. Next up, Silver Coil Apprentice. This one, whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, target creature gets +1 until end of turn. Not bad. Not amazing, though. The fact that it can buff any creature is very nice, so you can buff like an invasive creature and such, which is kind of cool. But I do also feel like this is kind of like the less exciting of the cycle, but it's still something to keep an eye out for limited, especially since Silver Quill looks like it's going to have a bunch of token-based synergies, so keep that in mind. Oh boy, and now let's talk about the competitive EDH Apprentice they revealed. Witherbroom Apprentice, green and a black. It's a 2/2 human druid. Whenever you cast or cast an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life and gain 1 life. Okay, for people who already watched my opinion on Professor Onyx, you probably know what I'm going to say here. There is a card in Magic called Chain of Smog. Chain of Smog, you can essentially do infinite copies to yourself. It's a cheap spell. So with Witherbroom Apprentice, you could do the infinite, essentially, copies to yourself, and then activate the Magecraft infinite times, drain out your opponents and such. Also keep an eye on the other Magecraft spells that are coming from the set, because that combo can still be relevant to them. Like, even the less exciting ones could still something to keep an eye on. Like, for example, like, as much as I was downplaying Silver Quill Apprentice, being able to buff something infinitely that's one of your creatures against swing in for lethal, something to keep in mind, or even Cronge's Apprentice, just drawing and getting infinite lands from your deck, especially if it ways to play multiple lands, or even making infinite treasures. Yeah, something to keep an eye on, let's just say. Next up, we're going to talk quickly about the rare land cycle of the set, which is the show lands that came from Shadows of Innistrad. We'll show the Shrine Shadow Snarl as an example. It's a land that essentially enters the battlefield. You may reveal a Plains or Swamp card from your hand. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped. So, overall, not a bad mechanic. This actually has some fun synergies with Snow Dual lands as well as Triome, so you got to keep that in mind. It's still going to be like the dual land cycle that you might like just for your deck design, especially for 2-color deck designs. Though pathways are a little bit better, it's still nice to have the completion of the cycle if you need it for your deck design. So, if you need it for your deck, you'll play it in your deck. But keep in mind, if you do, try to make sure it's one that has land types within the deck design so that these can enter and tap. So, play the Snow Duels or play the Triomes, stuff like that. And then we have Vine Glimmer Snar, Necroblossom Snar, Fury Calm Snar, and Frostboil Snar. Okay, so let's get to the other cards. We also get to the other mechanic in the set, which in this case is Ward, which is essentially semi-hexproof. It's essentially whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, keep that in mind, an opponent controls, counter it unless that player pays 2. And the example we're seeing here is Waterfall Elias, which is free in the blue for a free 1 flyer with Ward 2. This is actually the new Everwood keyword mechanic of the set, and this is actually a really, depending on how many ward cards we get in the set, this is a mechanic to keep an eye out on, because giving a semi-hexproof to your creatures, it's actually really cool. Like, being able to, like, make it where, since we're in a standard format where there's a lot of good instant speed removal at the 2 to even 1 mana slot, aka Bonecrusher Giant, stuff like that, being able to make them have to delay casting the quote-unquote adventure portion or removal spells until they can sink and spend 2 mana, being able to cause a delayed tempo on that is nothing to underestimate. So if we get enough good ward creature spells, this could fuel an archetype. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. And the best part is, even if they... essentially, it's only what spells that opponents control. So, if your opponent does spend the mana sink and you still have, like, a combat trick or, like, a way to give it hexproof, like with Snakeskin Veil and stuff like that, then you can still semi-protect your creature. It's actually kind of... this actually has the potential to be a pretty powerful standard mechanic, so keep an eye on it. Like one of the cards they revealed with Ward, which is the Torrent Sculptor, as well as the Flamethrower Sonata, yet again, having this MDSA duel, where essentially it's the dual colors of the house of one of the colleges, aka Prismari. Torrent Sculptor, 4 mana for a Merfolk Wizard. It has Ward 2, so it's a 2-2 with Ward 2. Okay. But it has, when it enters the battlefield, exile an instant sorcery card from your graveyard. And then put a number of +1/+1 counters on this equal to half that card's mana value, rounded up. It's actually pretty nice, especially since we're kind of getting to a spell scene set. Like, if you, at the very least, exile like a 2-cost spell, you're going to put 1 counter on it. And even just a 1-cost spell, you're going to put 1 counter on it. So then if you go free, you'll at least get 2 counters. 4, you still get 2 counters. And then it just gets better wide up. And the fact that it has the semi-evasiveness, very nice. It's not like the best creature in the world, but it's not bad. And then there's Flamethrower Sonata, which is pretty nice as well. Just a discard a card, then draw a card. When you discard an instant or sorcery card this way, this card deals damage equal to the card's mana value to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. That's actually a really nice kind of like lightning strike ability, especially since we have some very powerful instant sorcery spells in the meta. So just being able to say like discard a Genesis Ultimatum and just deal 8 damage to like a high velocity value planeswalker. Don't underrate that. And then also what's nice is that it's synergized with Torrent Sculptor, where you can discard like a high cost spell that you're not casting now. And then you can play Torrent Sculptor later and just put the counters on it. So both synergistic with each other. I do think this card has some potential, but I think it's most people are going to play it on the Flamethrower Sonata side. Though, keep in mind, you don't have to discard an instant sorcery spell. You can still use this as a rummage if you need to, especially if you're in a reanimator-based deck design. So, keep that in mind. overall, pretty cool card. And then I think that's almost it, besides the top cards that we're talking about here, which is both the Shadowed Silver Quill and the following lessons. So let's get through the lessons real quick. Introduction to Annihilation, 5-mana lesson. At 0 target non-land permanent, its controller draws a card. Simply put, this is a really, really, really good lesson. Being able to provide sideboard unconditional removal that can be tutored anytime you learn, or just being able to just, in colors or monocolored deck designs, have unconditional removal like this that you usually see in dual colored cards. Very good. Don't underrate this card. This card might be a best lesson card common of the set. Unconditional removal is nothing to underestimate. Then we have Introduction to Prophecy. Scry 2, then draw a card. Not that exciting, but keep in mind we do have ways to mana discount in the meta. So if you have a way to discount this spell, you could inevitably make this a free spell. Scry 2, then draw a card, which is something to keep an eye out on. So keep an eye out on that. And then last, but certainly not least, we are going to talk about one of the dragons from the Elder Dragon cycle, which each of them are the founders of the respective houses within the Strixhaven College, which in this case, Shadowed Silver Quill. 5 mana for a 2/5 legendary creature Elder Dragon. It has flying, it has double strike, and then at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may choose to, each mode must target a different player. It has, the modes are, target player creates a 2/1 white and black Inkling creature token with flying, target player draws a card and loses 1 life, or target player puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature they control. At first, I wasn't that impressed with this card until I talked to a few friends about it, and I do have to admit, this card is actually a lot better than I thought at first glance. First of all, when I was initially reading this, I didn't realize it was a May ability, so the fact that you don't have to choose these abilities and just attack in with essentially a 4/5 dragon because due to the double strike, very nice threat, and the fact that it's evasive because it has flying. And then when you need to activate these abilities, that's also really good too, because the factor is, these abilities are both beneficial to the opponent, but not beneficial to the part that you can't take advantage of it. Like, let's say, for example, you need to draw a card, and your opponent has a board state you don't really want them to put counters on, but you can just give them the quote-unquote flying token and still try to attack it with Silver Quill. Well, they obviously don't want to take 4 damage, so it'll be like, okay, I'm just going to block with the Inkling creature token, fine, okay. So then you still get your semi-card draw, but still essentially don't have to worry about the token, because you essentially just gave them a semi-fog in exchange for a card draw. That's actually really cool. There are even some times where maybe you get them the card draw and you make them lose life, because then it will be beneficial to your strategy, because maybe you need to just deal a few more points of damage to them, and then you win the game. This allows you to do that, so... And then if you just need to make your board presence wide, well, make your board presence wide. You really don't mind them having a token, so... And then, of course, in Commander, this is going to be a really fun card, especially for politics shenanigans, where maybe you make your opponent be like, oh, I'm going to give you this card draw if you do this, or I'm going to give you this token if you do this. Oh, you have a white board presence? I'm going to give you all counters on it if you do this, etc., etc., etc. So, overall, really good card, and also the alternate art on this is gorgeous. And I think that's all the cards that have been spoiled, at least in the main set. There has been a lot of Mystical Archive cards, which we'll see kind of like a quick glance of these. These I'm going to talk about in a separate video once they get all revealed, because I feel like it's better to look at them from that glance and such. So far, those are the cards that have been spoiled as of this recording for Strixhaven. I hope you all have a lovely day. This is LevDev, signing out. And boy, was this a cram session.